In the stillness of a spring dawn in 1623, a sound rose through the marble chambers of Topkapi Palace that no chronicler dared record in its raw truth. It was not the roar of janissaries returning from war, nor the chanting of muezzins that usually drifted over Istanbul's skyline. It was a scream, a high, piercing cry torn from the throat of a girl of only 15 winters. Princess Fatma Sultan, daughter of Sultan Ahmed I, filled the palace with a voice sharp enough to chill even the most hardened guards who stood outside her chambers. The eunuchs who patrolled the doors shifted uneasily, trained to remain unmoved by human suffering, yet they knew that what echoed within those walls was not permitted to be witnessed, not even by them. For 6 centuries, official history tried to bury what happened behind those gilded doors. Fatma's cry was not one of a wound or sudden illness. It was the sound of a ritual, the beginning of a process every Ottoman princess endured, a practice designed to strip them of self and remake them as instruments of dynastic obedience. It was a secret so deeply embedded in the empire's machinery that even its fiercest enemies could hardly have imagined such cruelty was practiced upon the daughters of its rulers. From outside the palace, the world imagined something very different. To millions of peasants, noble women and queens across Europe, the Ottoman princesses lived like earthly goddesses, draped in silk, crowned with jewels, served by dozens of maidens, their lives gilded with music and poetry. Tales of their beauty reached Venetian courts and Persian caravans, yet those stories were illusions, masks carefully painted over lives bound in silence. Behind the glowing walls was not paradise but a prison, not luxury but a nightmare so profound that many of these young girls would rather have welcomed death than their wedding night. And so, in this telling, you and I bear witness together. This is no fairy tale of golden palaces, but a story of horror woven into the very fabric of imperial ceremony. It is a reminder that even the most powerful crowns often rested on foundations of human sacrifice. The empire Fatma was born into was vast, a dominion stretching across 3 continents, ruled with a hand so firm that its shadow reached from Vienna's gates to the burning deserts of Arabia. Founded in 1299, the Ottoman dynasty endured until 1922, 6 centuries of power, where sultans believed themselves chosen to bend nations, faiths, and destinies to their will. After the conquest of Constantinople in 1453, the ancient Byzantine city was reborn as Istanbul, the beating heart of Ottoman might. And at its core, glittering like a jewel yet hiding a labyrinth of silence, stood Topkapi Palace. Within Topkapi, the imperial harem formed a world unto itself. By the 16th century, it held more than 800 women concubines, wives, attendants, daughters, all living under the careful orchestration of ritual and discipline. Outsiders imagined it as a place of endless pleasure, a perfumed cage of song and silk. In truth, it was an arena of unspoken wars, where the slightest glance or word could mean a woman's rise to power or her fall into oblivion. By 1530, when Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent granted the title of Haseki Sultan to his beloved Hurrem, the harem transformed from a private retreat into a political battleground. Concubines, many of them Christian girls, captured in raids or bought from North African markets, competed for the Sultan's gaze. They embroidered, sang, studied poetry, and above all learned how to obey. For them, the Sultan's favour could turn captivity into influence. Ironically, these women foreigners and slaves sometimes wielded more power than the princesses born of imperial blood. Between 1533 and 1656, in what historians call the Sultanate of Women, figures like Kursum Sultan and Turhan Hatice Sultan became de facto rulers of the empire. They guided wars, brokered treaties, and orchestrated successions all from behind veils. But while concubines could ascend as hidden empresses, the royal daughters themselves were bound in chains far more suffocating. They were not permitted ambition. Their role was fixed before they took their first breath. Pawns in a dynastic chess game, tokens to buy loyalty, cement alliances, and pacify rebellion. It was into this paradoxical world that Fatma Sultan was born in 1606, the daughter of Sultan Ahmed I and the formidable Kosum Sultan, a woman who herself would one day rule the empire from the shadows. Fatma's childhood seemed at first gilded with promise. She grew up wandering perfumed gardens where fountains whispered over marble. Tutors taught her astronomy, Persian poetry, the art of calligraphy. She could debate scholars in history and law, her words sharp with intelligence beyond her years. Chroniclers admired her beauty, but it was her brilliance that startled them most. By her early teens, she spoke 4 languages and could trace constellations across the night sky with the precision of an astronomer. Yet none of this brilliance mattered. From the moment she entered the world, her destiny was already written in the empire's ledger. She was not her own. She would never marry for love, nor choose her fate. Her life was to be given in exchange, her body the signature on treaties forged by men in council halls. Her husband was chosen long before she understood what marriage meant. Kara Mustafa Pasha, a hardened commander more than 20 years older, who had proven his loyalty on the empire's battlefields. For him, marriage to the Sultan's daughter was a ladder to political greatness. For her, it was the prelude to tragedy. 3 months before her wedding, Fatma was summoned into a process known only to the princesses of the Ottoman dynasty, Terbiye-i-Mubarak, the sacred education. It was a ritual that had no parallel in the world of concubines, no counterpart in the lives of queens elsewhere. It was not an education to empower, but to break, not to nurture, but to erase. And in this crucible of silence and submission, Fatma's screams began. The moment Fatma Sultan was chosen for marriage, her life shifted from the glittering halls of childhood learning into the shadows of an ancient ritual. The Terbiye-i-Mubarak, the so-called sacred education, was not meant to elevate her spirit but to crush it, to strip her of every trace of selfhood. For centuries it had been reserved only for the daughters of the Ottoman dynasty, and its goal was simple: to ensure that when they entered their husband's house, they were no longer princesses with minds and wills of their own, but obedient shadows trained to serve. Fatma's tutor in this ritual was Gulnar Hatun, the aged mistress of the harem, a woman who had overseen the conditioning of a dozen imperial daughters before her. Gulnar knew every detail of the ceremony, the bows, the words, the silences. She had long since buried her pity. To her, Fatma was not a child, but an heirloom to be polished and prepared for sacrifice. The girl was led into the Angelino d'Arce, the bride's chamber, a room lined with Persian carpets, ebony panels and gilded lanterns. To the outside eye, it seemed a sanctuary of beauty. But Fatma soon realized its true purpose. It was a prison, designed with no escape, every detail arranged to teach submission. From dawn to noon, she was drilled in endless rituals of reverence. She had to master 18 distinct bows, each with a precise meaning. A bow for greeting, a bow for listening, a bow for rising, even a bow for lying silently on the floor as though awaiting her husband's command. She practiced until her muscles ached, until her spine bent not by choice but by habit. Even the way she walked was no longer her own. Her steps had to follow strict patterns. The yürüyüş sakin, measured strides with her head tilted exactly 30 degrees, her hands always resting below her chest. Her gaze never raised higher than a man's knees. In every movement, the proud bearing of a princess was erased, replaced by the slow rhythm of a servant. But the harshest blow fell upon her voice. Fatma's vocabulary, once rich with poetry and scholarly wit, was reduced to just 43 permitted words. She was allowed to say only phrases of gratitude, apology, or humble request, words designed to serve others, never herself. If she slipped, if she dared to speak beyond the script, the punishment was immediate: fasting without food or water, hours of solitary confinement in dark chambers, or public humiliation before the entire harem. The brilliance that once dazzled scholars was now silenced, each word pulled from her like a jewel ripped from its setting. Every week her obedience was tested before a tribunal of women and eunuchs. At its head sat none other than her mother, Sultan. To the girl, this was the most bewildering torment of all. Kusum, who once cradled her as a child, now judged her like a coin on the scales of empire. It was not cruelty for its own sake, it was duty. A princess's body was the empire's property, her marriage a diplomatic weapon. Kusum could not afford to see her daughter only as an instrument of power. Yet even these indignities were only the beginning. Beneath the palace, in underground chambers built in secret, replicas of bridal rooms had been prepared. Here Fatma endured Talimi Gerdek, the rehearsals of the wedding night. She was forced to perform gestures and acts no child of 15 should have known, guided by cold-eyed instructors. To aid the training, wax mannequins had been crafted by Venetian artisans, figures carved with unsettling anatomical precision. Instructors demanded she practice with them, while scribes recorded every tremor of fear, every tear, every attempt at resistance. If she faltered, the punishment grew harsher. Day by day, her spirit was eroded, not by physical chains, but by rituals that seeped into the marrow of her being. She who had once dreamed of mapping the stars, now struggled merely to survive. Slowly, the light in her eyes dimmed. Her laughter vanished, replaced by silence. She was no longer the scholar who debated history and astronomy. She was becoming what the empire demanded, a body prepared for obedience. As the wedding drew closer, the rituals intensified. Fatma was transferred to the Gelin Kushku, the bride's pavilion, a chamber cut off from the outside world. Here, every aspect of her existence was controlled. Her meals were prescribed, pomegranates to symbolize fertility, honey and almonds for sweetness, goat's milk for strength, spices from Yemen for warmth. Even her baths became rituals. Each day, attendants poured scented oils over her body, valerian, poppy, orange blossom. Alchemists whispered that these mixtures contained secret substances, some to calm the nerves, others to dull resistance, and a few to create a dreamlike detachment, as though she floated outside herself. The pavilion's walls were hung with tapestries, showing the ideal wife, obedient, fertile, silent, rewarded with paradise. Venetian mirrors were placed at every angle, forcing Fatma to watch herself constantly. Once, these mirrors had been tools of Sufi reflection, meant to lead the soul toward God. Here, they were twisted into a weapon of control, turning self-awareness into self-policing. Fatma found no sanctuary even in her own thoughts, for the empire had taught her to mistrust herself. By this stage, the girl who once debated scholars could scarcely raise her voice above a whisper. She obeyed not out of choice, but from sheer exhaustion, her will eroded drop by drop. The empire had achieved its purpose. Fatma Sultan, daughter of emperors, had been reduced to silence. She was no longer a child of the stars, but a shadow awaiting her fate. And yet, outside her prison of silken mirrors, preparations for her wedding had already begun. Istanbul stirred with anticipation. The city's streets filled with musicians, merchants, and soldiers preparing for a spectacle. To the people, it would be a celebration of empire's glory, a festival of light and power. But for Fatma, the wedding was not a promise of joy, it was the final step into the abyss. At last, the day arrived. To Istanbul, it was a festival of triumph, but for Fatma Sultan, it was the funeral of her childhood. The streets blazed with torches as thousands gathered to witness the procession. Musicians struck their drums, trumpets blared, and poets recited verses celebrating the glory of the Ottoman dynasty. Every window of the city's houses was lit, every balcony draped with silks. To the people, this was not merely a wedding, it was the empire itself on parade, displaying its power, wealth, and divine favor. But behind the dazzling spectacle lay cruelty. For weeks, artisans had prepared ornaments, dresses, and jewels, each designed not for the bride's happiness, but to display her submission as property. Fatma was dressed in 7 layers of silk, the innermost dyed crimson to symbolize blood, the outermost pure white to proclaim chastity. On her head was set a crown of gold, heavy enough to bow her neck forward, so that every step mimicked humility. Around her waist gleamed a girdle, locked with a golden clasp that only her husband would be given the key to, an emblem of ownership disguised as ornament. As she left the bride's pavilion, Fatma was not permitted to look around her. Her eyes were fixed on the ground, her hands bound in golden cuffs. Ahead of her, slaves scattered rose petals, while eunuchs carried censers of musk and amber. The people cheered as if they were seeing a queen in triumph, but those closest to her saw something else, a girl walking like a prisoner toward her fate. The procession wound through Istanbul, from the palace to the groom's residence, lasting 3 days and 3 nights. At every stop, lavish banquets were held, tables piled high with roasted lamb, sherbets, fruits and candied almonds. Fireworks split the night sky. Jugglers, wrestlers and dancers entertained the crowds. The empire wanted the people to forget that beneath this festival lay a girl's silent suffering. When Fatma reached her groom's house, the Gerçek Gerdek, the true wedding night, was enacted. By then, she was nearly faint from exhaustion and silence. The chamber had been prepared like a stage, silks draped across the walls, incense thick in the air, mirrors angled to reflect every movement. Outside, a crowd waited in hushed anticipation, for Ottoman tradition demanded proof of consummation. Sheets were checked, whispers spread, reputations hung on what happened behind those golden doors. What followed, history veils in silence. Chronicles record the pomp, the jewels, the feasts, but never the tears of a 15-year-old girl whose body became the empire's bargaining table. Fatma Sultan was no longer a daughter, a scholar, or even herself. She was a contract sealed in flesh. And yet, even in this moment of darkness, whispers of resistance lingered. Some said Fatma's silence was not broken submission, but a shield, a way to endure, to survive long enough to reclaim fragments of herself. Others claimed that years later she would wield her suffering as a weapon, learning how to bend in order not to break. But on that night, under the watchful eyes of empire, she was only a shadow, an obedient bride offered up to power. When the songs of the wedding faded and the fires of celebration dimmed, what remained was silence. The empire had celebrated, the city had cheered, and the groom had claimed his prize. Yet for Fatma Sultan, the true story began only after the veils were lifted and the feasts ended. She was only 15, a child who had once studied astronomy, who had spoken of the stars with the wisdom of scholars, was now locked within a gilded cage of marriage. Her new household was not a sanctuary but a fortress of expectations. Every gesture, every word, every breath was measured against the rigid codes drilled into her during the Terbiye-i Mubarak. In her husband's palace, Fatma found little comfort. She was surrounded by attendants who reported her every movement, eunuchs who enforced silence, and a husband who saw her less as a partner than as a symbol of his bond with the dynasty. To him, she was not Fatma, the girl with dreams, but Sultan's daughter, a political trophy, a vessel for heirs. Her duties were unrelenting. At dawn, she performed rituals of service, pouring water for her husband, offering food with downcast eyes, speaking only in the permitted words. At noon, she was paraded in silks before his guests, forced to embody the perfection of obedience. At night, she was expected to submit her body without protest. Day after day, her life became an echo chamber of commands and silence. Yet the greatest cruelty was not the rituals nor the weight of duty, but the memory of who she once was. Fatma remembered the nights in the palace library, when she traced the constellations on parchment and debated history with scholars. She remembered the laughter of childhood, the taste of freedom, the promise of possibility. Now, those memories haunted her, like ghosts reminding her of a life stolen. But whispers of Fatma's endurance survived. Some chroniclers hint that she never fully surrendered her mind. Behind her silence, she listened, observed, and learned. She began to understand the fragile balance of power, the secret language of court politics, the art of survival within chains. Though her body was bound, her mind began to sharpen like a hidden blade. Tragedy, however, remained her shadow. Over the years, Fatma bore children, each birth weakening her fragile body, each infant another chain binding her to duty. Some of her children did not survive infancy, a grief she carried alone, for her tears were never to be seen. Chroniclers suggest that this quiet sorrow carved lines of steel into her character. As time passed, Fatma Sultan grew into a woman forged not by freedom but by fire. Her obedience, once a prison, became a mask. Behind it she learned patience, calculation, and resilience. Some whispered that she became an advisor in the shadows, guiding her husband with the wisdom she could never voice openly. Others believed that the silence forced upon her in youth gave her a power of observation unmatched among the women of her era. And yet, history records her not as the girl who loved the stars, nor as the child crushed by ritual, but simply as Fatma Sultan, daughter of the empire. Her name appears in treaties, dowry accounts, and court records, footnotes to the greater story of men. The empire remembered her not for her suffering, but for her obedience. But between those lines of history, a deeper truth lingers. Fatma's life was the price of an empire's ambition. Her body sealed alliances, her silence preserved dynasties, her suffering was hidden behind parades of gold. She was both victim and instrument, an unwilling sacrifice to the machine of power. And perhaps, if her soul could speak across the centuries, it would not cry out with bitterness, but with a quiet warning that beneath the silks, jewels, and rituals of empire lay the broken hearts of daughters, buried in silence.